Good afternoon, everyone. First, let me take an opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Victoria Hunter, and I am the new Public Information Officer for the Athens-Clarke County Police Department. I want to thank you all for joining us today for the press conference, and the purpose is to share the results of the department's review of the police use of force that occurred in the area of College and Broad Street following the May 31st protest of the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis, Minnesota police officers. The department's use of force review was conducted by Lieutenant Harrison Daniel, who is the commander of our Office of Professional Standards. In a moment, Lieutenant Daniel will share the details of his investigation, discuss his findings, and talk about some of the recommendations. First, you will hear directly from Lieutenant Daniel, followed by a short video we will share with you. The video includes a compilation of video from officers' body-worn cameras, our downtown camera system, and other sources to help you better understand some of our observations and the information the department had that ultimately led to the actions taken by our officers. As a side note, a copy of the video of this press conference will be made available at a later date. And finally, Lieutenant Daniel will entertain a few questions from the media. Without further ado, I present Lieutenant Daniel.
Good afternoon. My name is Harrison Daniel. I am a lieutenant with the Athens-Clarke County Police Department, and I'm currently assigned as the commander of our Office of Professional Standards. The Office of Professional Standards is responsible for oversight and management of employee conduct for the Athens-Clarke County Police Department. One aspect of that role is use of force. I'm here today to present an overview of the use of force investigation conducted by the Office of Professional Standards and its findings concerning the use of chemical irritants and impact munitions by the department as part of crowd dispersal efforts following the planned protests on May 31st, 2020 in downtown Athens. As part of that overview, there will be a brief video presentation. Prior to the events of May 31st unfolding, the department began receiving intelligence that indicated vandalism, looting, and violence would occur in conjunction with planned protests. The evidence showed that the department received credible pre-event intelligence of generalized threats to loot and vandalize Athens in similar manners as we had seen in Atlanta and Minneapolis, as well as specific threats to target local businesses and government buildings. The intelligence also suggested that local gun stores would be targeted for burglaries at the height of protests and while civil unrest was being dealt with elsewhere in the county. Additionally, pre-event intelligence indicated that certain extremist groups and agitators would be present within the crowds during the protests. Despite the pre-event intelligence, the Athens-Clarke County Police Department began the day by facilitating the free movement of the protesters and protecting their right to free expression. Then at about 7 p.m., an armed group of self-identified boogaloo arrived at the protest and began intermingling with protesters. Many protesters chose to leave shortly thereafter. However, a small crowd of individuals remained. The presence of boogaloo confirmed the department's pre-event intelligence concerning extremist groups and elevated the threat assessment at that time. The evidence showed that the real-time observations on that day were not limited to the identified boogaloo. Other individuals were seen wearing long-sleeve heavy clothing, rain jackets, all black clothing, Hawaiian-style shirts, carrying full weighted-down backpacks, and carrying firearms both openly and covertly. After about 9 p.m., individuals were also seen entering or remaining within the area of College and Broad, carrying gallons of milk, with heavy gloves, wearing full face coverings, wearing eye protection, with respirators, and one individual carrying a leaf blower. Additionally, 2 tents were erected within the crowd, and individuals were seen periodically entering and exiting these tents, while others stood around the outside of the tents. Finally, individuals within the crowd were seen and overheard agitating others to engage in violence and property damage. The department developed its pre-event and real-time observations and intelligence in conjunction with local, state, and federal law enforcement partners, as well as overt and covert sources on the ground. The investigation found that the pre-event intelligence combined with the real-time observations was consistent with protests in other cities that had turned violent and suggested the presence of extremists and agitators who intended to instigate violence and or property damage. It was therefore reasonable for the chief of police at that time to draw the conclusion that there was a public safety need to disperse the crowd. The chief of police presented other county officials with the intelligence and observations known to him at that time. Based on this information, he received approval for an emergency order and curfew enacted for the downtown area. The order was enacted shortly after 9 p.m. For about 3 hours thereafter, the department did not take any enforcement action toward the unlawfully assembled crowd at the area of College and Broad. Instead, the department and the county posted notices of the curfew on social media and county websites, disseminated it through media outlets, broadcasted it through the Nixle alert system, and spread the information through officers on the ground. The available evidence showed that the unlawfully assembled crowd was aware of the curfew as early as about 9:45 p.m. that night. As a final measure, shortly before midnight, the department repeatedly broadcasted a notification directly to the unlawfully assembled crowd using a department drone. The drone message warned the unlawfully assembled crowd that they were violating Georgia law, they were subject to being arrested, and force may be used during arrest. The message was repeated about a dozen times over the course of nearly 10 minutes. The available evidence showed that the department had information at that time which indicated that the drone message was effectively delivered and received by the unlawfully assembled crowd. Instead of heeding repeated warnings concerning the curfew and the potential for arrest and use of force, many within the unlawfully assembled crowd chose to remain. The evidence showed that these individuals instead assembled in a box formation, linked arms, and tightened their ranks. These actions significantly influenced the determination that chemical irritants were the most appropriate option to accomplish the goal of dispersing the unlawfully assembled crowd. And now I'm going to turn to a brief video presentation depicting some of the events from that evening. The first thing you're going to see here is the box formation and the linking arms I just mentioned, as well as the individuals beginning to tighten their formation. We'll pause for a second. The bubble that pops out here is one example of information that we were receiving live, real time at that moment, letting us know that the individuals within the crowd were aware there was a curfew and that they were aware that they were violating the law. At this point in the evening, this is approximately 3 hours after the curfew had been put in place. And as I mentioned earlier, through multiple sources, the message of the curfew had been disseminated, and the department did have real-time information indicating to us that individuals within the crowd were aware that the curfew was in place, were aware that they were violating the law, they were subject to being arrested, and that force may be used during the course of an arrest. In the center of your picture, what you can see, or in the center of the crowd, you can see the tent. Also, you'll see, here's our individual with a leaf blower, wearing a heavy jacket, full face covering, continuing to circle the perimeter of the crowd. And what you can see in terms of the tent is an example of individuals who were coming and going inside and out of the tent while others were standing around. Again, this is only a few moments involving the tent, but this tent was up for a significant amount of time where that same activity had been occurring. At the time this was being observed through our Overwatch, our crime analysis unit, this presented a significant threat given the totality of the circumstances that we had seen that day. And what you're about to see here is the initial deployment, and this is going to be actually innocuous, plain smoke. The first thing deployed by members of our department was not chemical irritants. And what you'll see is actually nothing at the bottom of the screen, because the first deployment occurred on College Avenue, a significant distance from the crowd, providing them additional opportunity to leave through an extra demonstration of force and a warning that the department was serious at this point in time. And what you can see in the overhead up top is kind of a good example to show you the distance the group was from the smoke. And as some retreat, what you can see is there are several individuals within the crowd who immediately, in a manner that suggests intent, come directly toward the officers and the smoke. And you'll also see this is the point in time where individuals began throwing objects and shooting fireworks in the direction and at officers. Again, if you pause it. Up to this point in time, no chemical irritants had actually been deployed. This was innocuous smoke, and it had been deployed in an area in front of the crowd and not directly into the crowd itself. This is the point where the first canister of chemical irritants was thrown. As you can see, immediately, individuals began approaching the canister, bending over, neither attempting to pick up or disperse or defeat the gas. Again, what you'll see is that at this point, all the chemicals that have been deployed are up at the front at the edge of the crowd and have not been deployed within the center of the crowd. At this point, like this, you're going to begin seeing individuals start to either kick or throw canisters back in the direction of officers. That particular individual that just kicked a canister of note was wearing a Hawaiian-style shirt that night. Now you're seeing individuals who are throwing the canisters directly back at officers. So here you can see this individual dressed in the manner as I had described earlier, wearing the heavy gloves, and then we're going to see another individual in just a second. If you look too, we have another person dressed in a similar manner as I had just described earlier, consistent with what officers were seeing that day and what some of our sources were seeing that day as well. as you can see here, and what you're about to see in a minute, is evidence to show that we were not restricting any of these individuals from leaving the downtown area. Though North Campus may be to their back, both east and west on Broad Street were open for them to leave at this time, though they chose not to. What you're going to see in the top right corner is a body camera video of one of our police captains who was on Broad Street at that time and was providing direction to the officers, ensuring that they were allowing protesters and individuals in this crowd who were choosing to leave or volunteering to leave, they were allowing them free exit from the area. You'll see a couple more individuals at the top left approach the last couple of canisters that were deployed. In this particular case here, after the fact, we can see that it appears as if that individual poured a liquid on top of the canister. And what you'll see is the officers at this point realize that these individuals, as well as a couple others, are not going to leave, and so they de-escalate at that point, stop deploying chemical irritants, and they go in just a moment to actually make arrests.
What's that? Okay, all right, thank you. That's fine. That's fine. A lot of water with a little bit of Dawn dish soap will get rid of that.
I got it in my bag.
And as you can see here, these officers are arresting these individuals who chose not to leave the area despite a multitude of warnings, and that arrest was made without any further force. All right, before addressing the policy findings on the use of chemical irritants and impact munitions, I'd like to provide a little bit of context concerning department policy and use of force investigations. First, Accpd policy requires that an officer report any time the officer uses force against another during the course of the officer's duties. Policy further requires an internal investigation any time there is a use of force incident, even when there is no suspicion or indication of wrongdoing by the officer. It is a standard operating procedure for the department. Additionally, let me point out that a use of force investigation is administrative only in nature. It is not a criminal investigation. The purpose is to determine whether or not the actions of the department and its personnel were within department policy. In light of this purpose, the scope of this type of investigation is the use of force event itself and the totality of the facts and circumstances surrounding the officer's decision to apply force and how the force was applied. It is also within the scope of a use of force investigation and within the purview of the Office of Professional Standards to provide recommendations on issues of policy, training, and equipment concerning use of force that may arise as part of the investigation. Second, the department's policy on use of force reflects the current legal standards established by the Supreme Court. This includes how we analyze force. This means that the department policy requires a use of force to be objectively reasonable, in consideration of the perspective of the officer, on the scene and in light of the totality of the facts and circumstances confronting the officer in the moment. Additionally, the assessment must reject our tendency to use 20/20 hindsight bias. Pursuant to department policy, the Office of Professional Standards opened a use of force investigation on June 1st, 2020 concerning the use of chemical irritants and impact munitions by the department and its personnel in response to the unlawfully assembled crowd in the downtown Athens area following protests on May 31st, 2020. This investigation found that the use of chemical irritants and impact munitions as part of the dispersal efforts was within department policy. First and foremost, the findings concerning any use of force are a matter of legal authority. Department policy requires that force may only be used to accomplish a lawful objective. The evidence showed that the individuals who obstructed the intersection of Broad and College and who chose to remain after receiving reasonable notification of the curfew were unlawfully assembled and in violation of Georgia law, Athens-Clarke County ordinance, and the emergency order. Additionally, the perceived threat to public safety and property if the unlawfully assembled crowd remained was reasonable. Therefore, the department had legal authority to disperse the unlawfully assembled crowd, and chemical irritants were authorized by policy. The objective to disperse the unlawfully assembled crowd was lawful. The Office of Professional Standards deemed the decision to use chemical irritants reasonable because the physical presence and the verbal commands of the officers were ineffective at dispersing the unlawfully assembled crowd. Instead of dispersing, the unlawfully assembled crowd was forming lines, linking arms, and tightening their formation, which indicated that officers would be met with significant physical resistance. It was therefore reasonable that an officer at that time would believe that a hands-on approach would likely result in clashing between police and the protesters, the use of batons, and increased risk of injuries to the officers and citizens. As an industry standard, chemical irritants are a lower level force option than impact weapons. Additionally, the evidence showed that the department initially deployed plain innocuous smoke, as you saw in the video, on College Avenue, away from the unlawfully assembled crowd, as a final warning and show of force before chemical irritants were deployed. Yet, individuals in the unlawfully assembled crowd immediately began throwing water bottles, throwing unknown objects, and shooting fireworks at the officers. These actions suggested that the intention of certain individuals within the unlawfully assembled crowd was to instigate and escalate confrontation with the police. The evidence further showed that the chemical irritants were initially deployed at the edges of or away from the unlawfully assembled crowd, giving individuals additional opportunity to retreat without being directly or significantly affected. Concerning individual officers' decisions to use impact munitions against certain individuals, the officers' actions were deemed reasonable and within policy based on the totality of the facts and circumstances confronting them at that time. The evidence showed that the individuals within the unlawfully assembled crowd did actually or attempt to pick up, kick, or throw deployed canisters of chemical irritants at officers or in the direction of officers, as well as attempt to disperse or defeat the deployed chemical irritants. The evidence showed that the officers who fired impact munitions were directly targeting individuals engaged in these acts. Despite the findings of the use of force by the department and the Office of Professional Standards that the department's actions by the officers were within policy, the Office of Professional Standards did identify several secondary shortfalls. First, the department did not have an adequately equipped or trained mobile field force capable of responding to incidents of mass civil unrest. This was a critical issue at the time because the department had to rely on state resources. And the loss of state resources would have meant that the department would be without a properly trained and equipped mobile field force that was capable of safely dispersing the unlawfully assembled crowd and quelling any violence. Therefore, the Office of Professional Standards is recommending that the department continue funding the development of a mobile field force that is properly equipped and trained to respond effectively to civil unrest, as well as develop appropriate policies for a mobile field force response to civil unrest. Second, though the department initially had a clear line of communication with protest organizers earlier in the day on May 31st, there was a failure by the department to reestablish a liaison and a viable line of communication with the individuals who remained beyond the planned events that day. Therefore, the Office of Professional Standards is recommending that the department identify specific operational improvements to establish and maintain continuity of its communications with protesters during civil unrest events. Third, there was an inadequate after-action response from the department concerning case development, which includes investigative follow-up, documentation, and collection of evidence. Therefore, the Office of Professional Standards recommends that the department improve the investigative and case development components of its response to civil unrest. In summation, based on the available evidence and in light of the totality of the facts and circumstances confronting the department and its officers at that time, the Office of Professional Standards found that the actions of dispersing the unlawfully assembled crowd and the use of chemical irritants and impact munitions during the course of the dispersal efforts were within department policy. And I'll open it up to a few questions at this time.
How many people were arrested and how many of those were students?
There were 18 people, I believe, arrested that night in the downtown area specifically. We arrested about 13 additional people who were involved in burglarizing one of our local stores that did sell firearms about shortly after this incident occurred. I do not know how many of those were students, if any at all.
What's the style of dress telling you guys ahead of time about protesters / agitators?
So like I mentioned earlier, what we were seeing that day through on-the-ground observation as well as overhead observation were individuals who were wearing long, heavy clothing, wearing all black, wearing not just masks as people were wearing that day legitimately out of concern for their health, but full head coverings and head wraps, wearing rain jackets, carrying heavy backpacks that looked full and weighted down, heavy gloves, respirators, then carrying other objects such as gallons of milk. When we look at that in totality of the facts and circumstances, any one thing alone may not raise significant alarm, but when you start seeing all those things in combination, what it suggests to us is that we have people who are potential agitators and that they would be there with the intention and the expectation of confrontation, of violence, and that they are prepared and planned for that. And that's what that suggested to us.
Beyond the protesting?
Say again?
Beyond the protesters' initial intent?
Yes.
What were they doing with the tent? Was that like a medical triage kind of a situation, or?
I don't know exactly everything they were doing with the tent. What I do know is at the time we were seeing the individuals coming and going from the tent while others stood in kind of a perimeter around the tent. That raised concern for us. We weren't sure what it was. It was kind of an unknown threat at that time, is my understanding. My understanding is also that, as you can see in the video, at one point one of the officers moves the tent. It appeared to not have anything significant in it of weight. And so I don't know anything else beyond that.
You also said that the department wasn't really ready for that. Is it ready now if another protest arises?
So my focus is the use of force event that day. That's the purview of my investigation. I'm not here to talk about, I guess, additional planning or preparation for future events, but that is ongoing. Any
About
other
the
questions?
impact munitions?
I'm sorry, say again?
About the impact munitions?
Yes, sir.
So that, they weren't mentioned in the initial press release from the department, and chiefs ruled that they needed to know about them at the time, or a few days later even. So I'm wondering who gave the order to fire those munitions?
So who gave the order? The
Who authorized that?
individual officers at that point in time had to make those decisions for themselves. And they submitted statements as part of this investigation. articulating the reasons they made those decisions. And based on that, like I said, their statements and all the evidence combined, those decisions were deemed objectively reasonable and within our policy at that time.
How many canisters were deployed that night?
There were approximately 13 canisters deployed that night. And several of those, I think about 3 canisters were plain smoke and were not chemical irritants.
Prior to the protest, you guys were investigating potential problems. What sparked that? Was that something the police department did on its own, or did intelligence come in that this might happen and that started?
So that potentially would pertain to some ongoing criminal investigation. I can't really speak to that at the moment. I'll take one more question, if there's any others.
Was the guy with the leaf blower, was he one of those arrested?
It's my understanding that he was not actually arrested that night. All right. Thank you all for your time.